All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of the dice placement series, where I am taking a deep dive into the mechanism of dice placement and other interesting ways to use dice. And today I'm very excited to have Keith Matejka on the show. He is the founder of Thunderworks Games and the designer of the Role Player and the various series of role player games that have kind of sprung out of that one great game. And Jamie Stegmeyer recommended that I talk to you, and I agreed with him. I think Role Player is a very cool game. So I'm happy to have you on, Keith. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed your program with Jamie. I always, I'm a big fan, so it's fun to see. Always fun to see his perspective on things.
Yeah, definitely. He, like most of us in this industry, lives, eats, and breathes board gaming and board game mechanisms and mechanics, and always has opinions and thoughts on those things. So it's cool to hear what he thinks. And something that he brought up in that interview, which is not something that I had previously, because I'm relatively new. I started designing games just almost a year ago now. And I've just been working on kind of one game for the past year. And so I'm still learning, still kind of getting the lingo. And one thing that I learned from Jamie was kind of the difference between dice placement and dice insertion, and how those are kind of two different ways of putting dice into a game to do various things. And so I'm curious kind of to hear your thoughts on, what are the differences between dice placement and dice insertion? Are there differences? What in your mind do those two different words mean?
Yeah, it was interesting, like watching that interview. Like some of these things I just don't, are just kind of like, I play a lot of games and I understand how a lot of games work, but I don't always like put a label on this thing and like think about like the, at least kind of putting them into buckets and stuff. But, to me, you can do a lot of interesting things with dice placement, obviously. And Jamie's done this before, but like the idea of like using your dice as workers is something that's really interesting. That's been done in a lot of games, and the fact that it has 6 different values on it means that you can manipulate those dice once they're already placed, and then they can function in different ways, either like a countdown or a count up, or they can set a priority as to who's going to take an action, or how many times somebody's going to get to take an action based on the value of the dice you play. So to me, like a lot of dice worker placement games, the worker has this extra characteristic of kind of being one of these 6 values, and you can do all kinds of interesting things with that. Not just like I'm marking this space as mine. It's more like there's this additional layer that you can throw on top of that, which can create a bunch of interest for sure. And then part of that value is, I think they were talking about dice insertion, the idea that like, the dice in a space that are coming from different players can be ordered, right? So because you've got the sequence of numbers, so you can explore this idea where like, okay, so this person placed here, but because I put a higher value die, I can bump them out of that space, or I'm going to get to do a better version of that action. A game like that that comes to mind that I played recently was the Artemis Project by the Grand Gamers Guild over there. They do something similar to that. There's dice are very. They're a great tool to use in a variety of different ways. It seems like we're always finding like new ways to use dice, not just as a random number generator, but like because they hold a value in addition to being an object that you can place in different places to signify different things.
Right. And so, it just opens up the possibilities of, like you said, comparing them to other dice that have been placed before, or limiting what dice can be placed next. And so the numbers, can signify so many different things.
Right.
And then a lot of these dice insertion games specifically also use color as a kind of way to give an extra value to that component.
And you could take that even further, right? So you've got like the fact that it's an object in the space. You've got a number that signifies something. You have a color that might signify something else. And then, you can kind of start going crazy. Like maybe you have different size of dice, and like the size of the die means something different than the number, which means something different than the color. And, you can kind of start going a little crazy, but,
love it.
Yeah, it's a very malleable object, and opens up a lot of different opportunities for game design for sure.
So let's go back to when you were kind of first working on Role Player, if you can remember back to that time. What kind of gave you the idea that dice would be a cool thing to use to kind of keep track of
Yeah,
stats and build out that puzzle?
yeah. So I mean, anyone who's played any any role playing game knows that dice is a big piece of that experience, and in most games. And so the idea initially was just like, I want to create this experience where you get to build a character, just like you do in Pathfinder and D&D, or like a computer RPG where there's stats have numbers, and dice seem like a logical place for that. So like I remember there's multiple ways over the years that like D&D has done for like building stats and homebrew versions where there's like roll 4 dice and drop one, or there's a bunch of different ways to do that, or like roll 8 dice and pick the top three or something crazy. So to me, dice just seemed like the logical place to go to. And then in my head, I had this vision of like 6 rows, 18 dice in this grid, and like it's like there's a lot of games that have grids, horizontal rows and vertical columns, and there's scoring based on all these things. That's kind of a whether it be Sudoku or Scrabble or a million other board games that have things like that. So the idea of kind of seeing those in a grid, and then seeing them kind of in this theme of building a fantasy character, it was like seemed like an awesome thing. So, but so the initial idea was just like all about placing the dice in the right slots, and trying to meet certain scores. But then it's about creating opportunities for player agency, in terms of how can
Right.
I make the players feel clever? What is this puzzle that they're trying to solve? What kind of tools are you going to give them to try to solve that puzzle? And so then it turned into dice manipulation. So I had this for whatever reason, and I feel like this is at least for not hardcore gamers, I guess. Like I had not realized at the time that there's like a standard layout for dice, that like the 1 and the 6 are always on the opposite side, and the 2 and the 5 are always
Yeah.
on the opposite side. So like I hadn't at the time, I didn't know that, and it was like this. Oh well, yeah, that's something that we should lean into. Let's make this a power that you can do.
Right.
Rolling is kind of the standard, which I ended up using for the wisdom, and then just like increasing and decreasing dice, which I used for the constitution ability. It kind of just came naturally to some degree. And then, just had that brainstorm of like, what other things can you do with dice that are like simple to understand, to manipulate them. And I don't think I didn't come up with anything above those three, but I'm sure there's or variants of those three things of like a +2 or -2. Like that's kind of a variant of the +1 +1 idea, or +1 - 1 idea. But yeah, so that was kind of the core of manipulating the dice. There was dice games out there. I mean, I play a lot of games, and did back then as well. So Kingsburg was like the big dice game, and
Mm.
Alien Frontiers was the new game on the scene that was doing a lot of
Ah,
dice manipulation. I know Jamie mentioned both of those games in his interview, but like those are both games that I
yeah.
played a lot of at the time, and I'm still fans of. So it seemed like there was this genre of games about manipulating dice that there weren't that many entries into, and I had this kind of what I felt like was a unique take on it, uh, and that's kind of where it started.
And one thing I like about Role Player is that it's not only a matter of manipulating dice to get the faces you want and put them in the rows you uh, and get the values you want, but then it's also the physical movement of a dice from one row to another and how that affects the total of the different rows. And I
Right.
think that's kind of a cool concept that maybe folks who are working on a dice placement or dice insertion game can kind of leverage a little bit more. Is it's not only the value of the dice themselves but also their relation to other dice and being able to manipulate that. So you
Right.
really kind of open up the possibilities to where, because you're right, there's only so many things you can do with a dice. Flip it over at +1 - 1, re-roll it. But then when you add, the physical layout of where they are, that
Right.
kind of opens up a whole new ball game.
Right. So then
Very
we
cool.
had like the swapping of placement of dice, and there's like quite a few cards that reference like moving a die to an open slot that you've already, as you're trying to solve this puzzle, right? Because there's so many different pieces of this puzzle that you could potentially get points from, and you're trying to maximize all those, and you're not always getting the perfect die every turn. So you're kind of mitigating risk as to like what you're likely to be able to complete versus what you're not, and that comes into focus as the game is going along, and what you thought was like the right way to go at the beginning of the game might not be the by the time you get to further into the game might not be the right path, so then you end up doing something else, or you get some card that is giving you bonuses for some additional thing that you weren't considering at the beginning, so now you're manipulating the placement of these dice in addition to their values. And there's ways to swap out the color of the dice from dice that are in the bag and all this other stuff. So yeah,
Yep.
it's an interesting puzzle, and it's been fun to create all the content over the both expansions of giving people more tools or different tools to kind of see how they want to try to solve the puzzle and give people new ways that they're going to get points for organizing their stuff in different ways. Yeah.
Were there any kind of limitations or frustrations working with dice as like the primary mechanism in the game that you can think of?
Um, so from kind of holistically from a publishing perspective, definitely,
Yeah.
I knew I wanted this game to at least play 4 players. So that means I have to have 73 dice in the box because everybody has
Oof.
18 on their board plus the one extra one for the last round. And I had this experience of like trying to figure out how I was going to get this game made, and the dice aren't cheap. Somewhat surprisingly, actually. But
Right.
so then my manufacturing cost was going to be significantly higher than I was anticipating, and which meant that my price for the game was going to have to be higher. So I actually, this is very unusual because most of the time when you play prototypes or you're playing a game in development, 90% of the time a lot of the discussion is about like simplify, focus on the fun part, get rid of all the stuff that's superfluous, and focus on the most fun part, and that's where your game is. And I was in this position where I had built a fairly light game. The puzzle was still there, but it wasn't nearly as complex as the final product. And I had this idea that if I have to price the game at this price point, people's perception of the complexity of the game that they're getting for that price point needs to be at least at a certain point. Like
Mm,
if it's a 10-minute super filler and it's $60, that just doesn't work for people.
right.
So I actually went in and made a concentrated effort to add layers of complexity in the game,
Mm,
just so that like the initial or the eventual price point would match people's expectations in terms of the complexity of the game. So
interesting.
if you're familiar with role player, the whole idea of the initiative cards at the beginning, or that where you roll the dice onto, and they're put into a numerical order, and that's going to determine what order you're going to buy cards in. Like that, that was all a late add when I was trying to kind of
Mm,
deepen the game strategically. Whereas previously it was much more like here's dice roll them into a pool, and everybody's going around picking one, and
ah,
then everybody can buy a card if they want. Like it was much lighter in terms of that. So um, that was like because the dice cost more. That was a limitation of that component that forced me to make other
interesting.
decisions. Um,
Yeah,
versus
that's a good point, and I think that's something that even if folks are just planning to design a game and not publish it, they still need to kind of keep that in mind. If this is a game that requires lots of dice, that's going to add to the cost of the game. That's going to add to the cost of, I imagine, shipping too, right? It's going to be heavier. It's going to
yeah,
require a bigger box, and so all the costs are going to go up with that. And like you said, it's a weird thing where the perceived value of something needs to match the price they're paying, and so that usually means the complexity or the heaviness level, right? And so
right,
if you're going to be paying close to $100 for a game, you want to have the experience of that meaty experience,
right.
and you might have to add more layers onto it to get
Right.
that.
I mean, there's other considerations like if you use your dice come in a variety of sizes, and if you get smaller dice, then you can make the game a lot cheaper. If you don't have a lot of different custom size, like if you don't have custom dice, can cost a little bit more, although they don't cost as much more as you would think. Whereas in like
Hmm.
Like for example, in Sagrada, the dice are, I think they're 14 millimeter in that game. They might, whereas in Role Player they're 16 millimeter, which are kind of like the standard size. And I was like stuck on the 16 millimeter game because I was like, those are the kind of dice that people play D&D with. So those are the kind of dice that I need in my fantasy game.
Interesting.
Um, and obviously you're moving them a lot, so like I don't want them to be like baby dice or whatever. So you can lower the manufacturing costs based on the size of the dice as well. And 12, 14, and 16 millimeters are kind of like the standards. But like, for example, Rolling Realms has a like a 1 inch die or something, and
Huge
it's
dice.
like
Yeah.
massive. But so you can do stuff like that. I mean, that's an interesting. When looking at the production on that game, it's interesting that I think you know I thought it was a good call that he used those big dice because they sit in the center of the table and multiple people have to read them from a distance, whereas in with
Oh,
smaller dice,
true.
I assume that was part of the decision making process too. Like um, being able to read the important game components, especially if they're shared in the center of the table, it's something to consider when you're deciding what kind of components you want to use. But all that is kind of more on the publishing side than on the design side. But it's interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, it is interesting, and it's stuff you might not consider when you're trying to design or publish. Because a lot of folks nowadays are trying to design and publish all together, go to
Sure.
Kickstarter and do everything themselves. So this is great. Food for thought. Things folks might not think about is the size of the dice. How something I didn't even consider is the size of the dice relative to who's looking at it. Right? If it's something you just have on your player board, it doesn't have to be as big as like dice that maybe everyone's looking at and
Right.
sharing in what the numbers are.
Right.
So that's very interesting. I like
And
that.
the number that you're rolling at a time, right? So like you can't. It's hard to roll
Mm.
20 16 millimeter dice at once, but if they're
Oof.
12 millimeter, you probably can. So like I don't know what the average hand size is, but like you keep that in mind as how many you're likely to be rolling at a time when you're determining the die size as well.
Yeah, I remember in one of Jamie Stegmaier's design diaries, he mentioned that he was originally going with like a thicker, even bigger die, or was wanting to go with a thicker, bigger die for Rolling Realms. But then when he got the prototype and he rolled it on the table, he felt like it could almost break or chip the table because they were
Right.
so heavy and
Yeah.
so big. And so you can go overboard with that too.
Right. Definitely.
So it's something to play around with.
It's interesting.
Cool. If you had to do it all over again, is there anything you would do differently when designing and creating role player?
If I could do it all over again, I mean, I think there's always room for improvement, right? So there's things that I've gotten better at over the years in terms of like I probably should have like hired a better rules editor at the time. Like
Yeah.
I was like the scrappy young publisher. I'd done a couple games and I mean I learn stuff every day. But like there's some cards in there that could be worded a little bit better probably or there's like one or two pieces of art that like I probably would have like gone through another art direction phase or something. But in general, I mean, I still play role player every once in a while, whether it be demoing it at conventions or friends of mine who haven't played it. They're like, "We should play your game." I'm like, "Okay, well,
Oh
we'll
yeah.
play it." Like,
Nice.
sometimes when you've played your game, thousands of times, I want to learn new things. I'm not always super excited about like playing role player just for fun. Though I will play my older games and then I'll be like surprised how much I like them. I'm like, I really like this
Nice.
game. And I'm
That's
like, well,
good.
obviously
Yeah.
I not designed it for my own tastes. Hopefully I
Right.
like it. So yeah,
Yeah, and role player is one of those games that can stand the test of time just because it's a good game and
right,
it's solid and simple. The core mechanisms are simple enough, but it gives you enough of a challenge and differentiation because there's the different things you put on the player board to change what the character
right,
needs
yeah,
to build, and then you have the cards coming out that are always different items and things you can equip. So
yeah.
it gives you a different experience for
It
sure
does.
every
It's
time you
it's
play it.
I do I still enjoy playing role player for sure. Um, and I'm trying to think like if there's anything I would change. I mean, it was such an interesting, like, the publishing journey was interesting for me because it was a project that did okay on Kickstarter. I mean, I think that's probably the result of me like not knowing a whole lot about marketing or sales. Um, but it was my third project, so like I've been around the block a couple times, and it did okay. You know, I think it did about 52,000 on Kickstarter, which um,
Yeah.
you know let me print the game, and that was cool. But like as soon as it kind of hit retail or the hit backers tables, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. Like there was this fervor of people trying to get the game because it was hard to find because I didn't print that many
Interesting.
because
Oh,
the Kickstarter didn't do amazing.
yeah.
So it took me, I took out like a personal loan from a friend to get the second print run going right away, and it took
Wow.
me probably a year to really kind of catch up, reasonably catch up with demand on the game, which was super exciting, but it's also frustrating where like people want to play your game and they can't get it.
Yeah.
And like they're mad at you about it, I guess. Like I'm doing the best I can. Um,
I think
but
I probably want it to go that way rather than having like a big splashy Kickstarter and then it just trailing off. People
right,
play it, they don't
right,
like it or whatever, and
right.
then
You
you
don't
never
want
hear
like a
from more
warehouse
about it.
full of cardboard that nobody wants.
Yeah. You
That's
did the right thing. It was, a modest Kickstarter, and then it's just kind of grown ever since, and it's
yeah,
led to expansions and other games. And speaking of which, I did want to talk a little bit about the newest game in the line, the role player line, which is Role Player Adventures, I
yeah,
believe. And that looks really exciting because I haven't played it, but I've watched some playthrough videos and previews and stuff. And from what I gather, you're basically taking the the characters that you built in Role Player. You can, or optionally, you don't have to, but you're basically, the idea is you're taking the characters from what you built in Role Player and then
right,
actually sending them on an adventure, which
right.
is really cool. And I'm sure people were asking about that the whole time. Like, I'm building these characters, I want to do stuff with them.
Right. The number of
Um,
times that I received that feedback is impossible to count. But
yeah,
so yeah, I mean, Role Player Adventures is the project that I always wanted to work on, and I just knew that if I wanted to do it the way I wanted to do it, it was going to be kind of huge-ish in scope. Just because I wanted to do a narrative game that really was all about choice, player choice, and I wanted to make sure that those choices mattered. Like, I've played a ton of like narrative video games where they're like it's the illusion of choice, where like if you pick A or
right.
B, it feels like you're making a different choice, but you end up at point C no matter what you do or whatever. So
Yep.
we wanted to build this game, and it took a really long time, and I knew I couldn't. I didn't think I could do it by myself because at the end of the day, I'm not a writer. I feel like I have a pretty good sense of what is or is not good writing, but I'm not a writer myself. So I was kind of waiting for the right partner to come along, and my friend James basically was really excited about the idea and wanted to work on it. And I said, "This is going to take at least 3 years of your life to finish. Are you sure you're on
Yeah.
board to do this?" And he said yes, so we did it. And
Wow.
to me, it's a big accomplishment. It's the game I always wanted to make, and I'm really proud of it. In terms of design, the part that was, supporting the import of any character that you've made in Role Player with any combination of expansions or promo cards and stuff, and trying to make those things have value in Role Player Adventures the way people expect. I mean, that was definitely a challenge. So if there's,
Yeah.
I don't know exactly. There's probably at least, I don't know, maybe 200, maybe 150 Role Player like cards across like market cards off all the expansions, and so like that
Wow.
means out of the gate I have to, I try to avoid anything repeating in my games. Like there's no duplicates of any cards in Role Players,
Okay.
right? So once you have the obnoxious card, there's not two cards in the game that
Mm.
have that. I always like every card to be unique and interesting. So that means out of the gate, I have to have a system that supports cards that have 150 abilities that are unique, that all
Oof.
that any player could have any combination of these cards and still create compelling, puzzle system and stuff. So, and then obviously the game has to have a bunch of new things that people get. Like you're not going to go on adventures and not
Yeah.
get any treasure, right? So,
Right.
um, so just the sheer scope of like different abilities that needed to be designed, and building a system with those abilities that is simple to understand and encourages communication. So I've never designed a cooperative game before. So this is Role Play Adventures is the first cooperative game I've ever worked on. Um, and to be honest, like I'm not a huge co-op game fan. Like The only ones that I really dig into are ones that are highly narrative because I want to go through the story with my friends. And
Yeah.
to me, the narrative is the primary draw for me. But definitely building a system that supported as many things from role player to import was challenging. We went through lots of revisions of it. There were at least, I think there was 3 full systems where I was like, this is it. We're playtesting it. And
Yeah.
then, I sit with for a while and I say, you know what? There's
It's not
something
working.
fundamentally problematic with this. And the
Wow.
whole thing goes in the garbage and you start over.
Oof.
So like, um, the one of the first, it was a deck building game at one point in terms of like, your character has 3 strength, so that means you have 3 strength cards in your deck, and then you're drawing cards and playing them and adding cards to your deck, and kind of traditional deck building kind of stuff. Um, but then it had this narrative, this kind of narrative dissonance in it. The idea of like I have a longsword, but I didn't draw it, so I can't use it in this combat. I don't know. That just felt weird to me. So I ended up like scrapping that system entirely, even though at one point I was really excited about it. There was like an action allocation system where like you had items and they had cubes on them, and you could spend the cubes to activate the items, and it was like it worked, but it was really fiddly, and it also bounced up the component cost of the game significantly. It also became really cumbersome when you had more than 4 or 5 cards in front of you. So yeah, that's just kind of the design process, and some of that comes. I definitely embrace iterative design. Take it as far as you can, and then chuck it and start something else, and you're going to do it better. I mean, even if it's the same core system, like if you start over, you're going to have learned all the stuff from the previous system. I don't get precious with my ideas. I rip them up into shreds faster than I come up with them. Sometimes it feels like,
Wow. Yeah.
but and some of that comes from I worked in video games for 15 years, and
Uh,
I've seen guys make entire levels that just ends up in the garbage because some random
yeah.
decision or some other decision, but the next thing they build is better because of the experience that they have. So you have to be, you know it's really easy to kind of latch onto your ideas and think they're great and want to polish them, whereas I'm more likely to just throw them away and start over. um, it feels wasted sometimes, but I think that's how you get to the stuff that's the best, I think.
I think that's great advice, and you're right. Even if you're scrapping it, you learn something from that process, and the next time you go through, you're a little bit better. It's kind of like going 2 steps forward, 1 step back. If you keep doing that, you're still eventually moving forward, right? Even
Right.
though it feels like you're bouncing back and forth or you're losing out. So that's great advice. I think that's kind of a good place to wrap things up. A couple last questions I have for you. What are there any kind of games on the horizon that use dice in interesting ways that you're looking at as part of Thunderworks? Next releases, anything like that?
Nothing dice related.
You've kind of done everything. You did what you want to do with dice. You're ready to move
no,
on.
I mean, I have some projects that have dice in them coming up, but I'm not like really talking about those yet.
Sure,
But a dice are a great tool. But not every game has to have dice in it either. So
sure,
I don't have anything specific coming up, but we do have more cartographers content coming, which is obviously you know uses a deck as a randomizer, and we've got a upcoming cool worker placement game called 10 Petty Parks. So those are kind of some of the newer things
cool.
coming from Thunderworks.
Awesome. I'll put a link to Thunderworks below this video so folks can check out all of that stuff and sign up for updates. So before we go, let us know what your kind of current favorite dice placement game is that's either new or that you've played before.
I mean, the most recent one that I played was Artemis Project, which I mentioned before, which is
Mhm.
a really fun game. And I still like Alien Frontiers for some reason. Like I still go back to that game.
Yeah.
It's not it's not a perfect game for sure, but it does a lot of interesting things and it's quick and it's fun.
Yeah, it's like it's not trying to be, it's one of the original dice placement games, and it's not trying to be, all this grand stuff. It's just you put dice down, you kind of have to line them up in a certain way, and it's very streamlined, which is really nice. So I think that's a good pick. Cool. Thanks again, Keith, for the time and for the great insights. Lots of great kind of tips and tricks here for the designers out there who might be looking to implement dice in interesting ways in their next game projects.
Awesome.
So take it easy, and we'll talk to you later.
All right. Thank you, sir.